Future has become our dream time. I think he's going to expand on that tonight. Please welcome David Graeber.
Thanks so much. Thanks for giving away my punchline, too. Well, figure out something to say about it.
David, welcome. We're in Norway, Stavanger.
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
The principle that you don't need to have these monitoring systems to tell people what they're worth.
Who should read your book?
I think everybody should read my book, or at least buy it.
And that's what the state is. It's a bad form of organization. So I always say capitalism is just a bad way of organizing communism. Because real, actual production is always cooperative. In a similar way, the state is a bad way of organizing people because they wouldn't have to constantly threaten you with guns if they knew what they were doing.
I'm old enough, I actually remember the 70s when computers were were kind of a joke. Whenever something went wrong, everybody was like, oh, let me guess, the bank had some computer, right? And now we've got to the point where the only part of our infrastructure that always works are ATM machines. I think this is incredibly symbolically important. It never gives you the wrong amount of money, right? So it gives you this idea that finance is the only thing that's really real. The only thing, the escalators don't work, the trains don't work, the infrastructure doesn't work, but the money always works.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll stop the video.
Okay, you can decide who then.
You were like saying these two different things, and I was a little.
What point did you get in?
I got it at 7:13.
The classic definition of direct action, for example, is if there's a community that doesn't have drinking water because there's no well, normal political action, you go to the governor and you sign a petition, or you could even blockade their house, but that still isn't direct action. Direct action is you go off and dig the well yourself and dare them to stop you.
So this sort of brings us to capitalism, probably.
Okay. Let's talk about that.
Let's talk about capitalism.
But nonetheless, people like to frame it in those terms. One of the most fascinating concepts I discovered when researching this was the notion of the milk debt. This is a medieval Chinese Buddhist concept. What they did was they calculated what they thought was the exact number of pecks of milk you absorbed from your mother in the first years of your life. And that's a fundamental debt you owe to your mother. So okay, you owe exactly 37 pecks of milk. But then they would say, all right, to pay back even like 1 day's worth of milk would in fact take 400,000 years of feeding her off your own personal flesh. I mean, so it was a way of saying like you could not conceivably pay this debt.
So I think nothing could be more important than just generalized debt cancellation. And I'm a person who paid back my student loans, So this whole like, wow, it's not fair to the people who paid it back, Personally speaking, as someone who took 15 years to pay back all my student loans, I will say that logic that it's somehow unfair to me for other people's loans to be forgiven makes about as much sense as saying it's like unfair to a mugging victim not to mug everybody else.
He has a very detailed analysis of how chiefship works in a lot of Amazonian societies, whereby basically being a chief is just like this complete pain in the ass. I actually knew our anthropologist who was one of these guys called the Kaapur, who would tell these stories about essentially what being a chief meant was like you had to wake up 2 hours earlier than everybody else. They're all sort of lying there in their hammocks, and you have to get up to jangle your tools really loud. Well, I'm going off to the fields to work, guys. I don't know about you. And, you had to constantly give away everything you have. You work harder than everybody else, but then you're giving it all away to make people happy, and everybody's criticizing you, making fun of you all the time. It's a miserable job,
And there's a million different responses. Actually, the response I think I came up with thought would be most effective in that context was the economical one, which is, if profits are your reward for taking risk, well, you're supposed to be taking a risk. So, I mean, the whole point of a financial system is to guide money towards wise investments. And if you have a system like the IMF imposed on most of the world where you're going to get paid back no matter what you do, there's absolutely no incentive to make intelligent loans. Hello. Yeah, actually, I find it. This is tall. Is there some way to bring it down? Too complicated for me. Tilts instead of. There we go. All right. One of the fascinating things I find is the degree of securitization, just in terms of how much labor is sort of guard labor. I have an economist friend who's been working on this, and so estimates that 20 or 30% of all labor, that's done in America is, basically watching people from keeping them from rebelling in one way or another. It's sort of similar to the people who argue that 10 or 20% of all work now is really compensation for the fact that people work too much. So all these jobs that wouldn't have to exist, except everybody's working too many hours. You need all-night pizza delivery men, and all the additional medical and psychological costs of too much work. Actually produce a lot of the work which people are doing. So it's completely a vicious circle. So this has nothing to do with human need. It has to do with the need of maintaining a system of radical inequality, which it turns out is really, really expensive in terms of hours. Which is precisely how you have this crazy situation where. We're not actually, the manufacturing sector shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. We're importing more and more of what we consume, yet somehow the actual amount of work that everybody does has increased pretty radically.
But in a way, it's almost inevitable if you grow up in a household where anarchism is considered a reasonable political philosophy that you will become an anarchist, because the way I think of it is, most people don't think anarchism is a bad idea. They think it's insane.
Within
not really.
bosom
No.
of LSE? Not really, yeah.
I mean, at LSE, yes. LSE, for some reason, hired me knowing exactly what they were getting. Yale hired me not really knowing what they were getting because, well, I mean, I don't know, maybe I declared myself an anarchist, maybe I hadn't, but nobody really cares what you say, because when academics say this sort of thing, everybody assumes they're lying. You can say pretty much anything you want about who you are as long as you're willing to be a hypocrite about it. But the moment they discovered that I actually did do even a little bit of real anarchist stuff,
Yeah.
slightly non-hypocritical, then
But what you are doing is you're a debt to your parents, and then you become a parent. So you're annihilating the difference. You owe a debt to the sages, you become a sage. You owe a debt to humanity, you become humane. Could that apply to the cosmos? Well, yes, according to most Hindu scripture, that's exactly what's happening, because you are the cosmos. And if you think about it, the idea that you owe a debt to the cosmos, and this crops up again and again, debt to nature, debt to society, debt to these huge institutions larger than yourself, is kind of absurd, because a debt is a business transaction. And a business transaction is by definition an arrangement between two legally equivalent entities. They make a deal. Now, how would you enter into a business transaction with the entire universe, everything that is or has ever been, including yourself? You kind of make a deal with them. Well, it's absurd. So the only way to actually sort of undo the debt is what they're saying, is what you realize in rituals, if you're doing them right, is that you are the cosmos. There is no difference. So there is no basis to say there's a debt at all.
An hour of talk and then the same again for questions or something like that. Definitely working.
Hello. Yeah, mine too.
Who's starting?
You'll do the first two sentences, and then I'll pick up.
Okay.
A friend of mine was starting a magazine, wanted me to write something provocative, so I kind of threw something out. It's more like the kind of slightly drunken rant you might say at a party than article. But she said, no, Des will publish anything you say. So I said, all right, what the hell? And before I knew it, the thing had gone viral. Actually, a strange thing I've just discovered. I used to think I just don't like to drink, because I hate beer and wine. It just makes me vaguely sick. And only very late in life have I discovered that actually, no, I have extremely expensive taste, and I was always poor, so I never found out.
Debt is basis of morality. In fact, even the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic actually reads, "Forgive us our debts, just as we forgive those who owe us money." But of course, the trick there is we don't normally forgive those who owe us money. So it's sort of implying, well, you're a sinner, aren't you? Why should God forgive you? But he does, because what is sacred is not to pay debts, but to forgive debts in the Old Testament and New Testament.
It's true of most North American, Native American societies. There's this notorious eloquence of chiefs and leaders of these societies, and they were so moving and so brilliant in their oratory that even the American soldiers who were basically sent there to kill them all and commit genocide would be reduced to tears and be sobbing, before they killed them anyway. How would these guys be so incredibly persuasive and moving, even when speaking not in their own language? And then I realized that these guys had no coercive power whatsoever. The entire institution was set up in such a way that you couldn't make anybody do anything. Pretty much the only way that you could get someone to do anything was by being really, really convincing. So their entire job was to be incredibly persuasive.
I mean, who knows what those guys could be inventing? If they actually had the time. I did a TED Talk once, and I kind of did the anti-TED Talk. I don't know if anybody ever noticed, but
I didn't watch it.
It was an alt-TED, and I basically pointed out that I talked about political pleasure.
I want to talk about political happiness, or even political pleasure, which immediately sounds like a really strange concept, right? Because very few people on Earth have actually experienced this. But I have. And actually, I should probably start by making a confession. I actually kind of like going to meetings. I mean, not work meetings. Those are uniformly horrible. But some activist meetings, and some activist meetings are also horrible. But
if you could define a fair society by edict.
Okay, I'm now the dictator.
How we used.
Yeah, and it gets worse the more radical the demo. I still remember this moment in Quebec City. We've been tear gassed for 8 hours straight. There's pitched battles, people tearing down walls, fighting back and forth, the cops with baton charges, and we all went down to this street to sort of get fresh water and something like fresh air, and sort of staggered down there, and some reporter walked up to me and said, well, according to polls, 75% of the public say they're for free trade. How would you respond to that? And we're just babbling something utterly incoherent. And, I was this person, later I realized that, the thing to say is, why are you using the phrase free trade? I'm not against free trade. We're not talking about free trade. There was something I could have said, but I didn't say it. But, I mean, it's like asking somebody who's just been hit on the head to do a math problem. I'm a person who's basically paid to be articulate. I usually can field those things pretty well. But even I was a blithering idiot, so I can,
When you say you can be queer in the world wherever you go and not worry about being killed, I would choose that instead of a flying car. I don't have a car.
Well, sure. I mean, we're near there. My response. I mean, I didn't. What was the question? I mean, no.
Very journals about the invention of a Dario and a Dario as this construct of the European imagination. You see, I told you we always get into trouble.
Yeah. Ignore that.
Who's behind the screen?
Such as global justice and Occupy Wall Street, where you were credited with creating the term "We are the 99%."
Actually, it's very funny that you started a story about Alexander Brenner, because I felt I was in a similar. It reminded me of a situation I was in Goldsmiths when I was asked to be the commentator on a talk by a French philosopher named Stigler. I don't know if people know about this person, Stigler. He's kind of a Heideggerian former bank robber. He was actually in prison for having robbed a bank and started reading Heidegger, which apparently they leave around in French prisons as a form of rehabilitation. And it worked on him. He became inspired and wrote to Derrida, and one thing led to another, and now he's a philosopher. And they asked me to head of cultural studies, who I will not name, at Goldsmiths, I was teaching at Goldsmiths at the time, asked me to give a comment on a talk he gave. And I said, well, do you have the tech? And first I said, no, come on, I don't know anything about Heidegger, I don't know anything about technology or any of this stuff. I said, oh, come on, it'll be fun, just make something up. So I said, okay, do you have a copy of his text? And he said, no. So I went online and I studied the guy's stuff and I kind of figured it out, and I thought I figured out some of it. And so I came there, he started talking. 2/3 of the way through, I'm saying, okay, I can follow this, I've read up. And then he starts going into this new theory he's just developed. And the guy might as well have been speaking Urdu. I had absolutely no idea what a single word he was saying meant, or what the point of the paper was. And then they were like, yeah, now David Graeber will begin his response. And I was there like, oh, well, maybe we should put this in a larger context, maybe in a political, and I was just flailing around, just like completely making a fool of myself for about 10 minutes. And as soon as I'm done, this Russian guy in the audience gets up and says, everything you guys are saying, it's all bullshit. I am a student of Giorgio Agamben. And he pulls down his trousers and takes a shit. And it was Alexander Brenner. And I remember thinking, like, you asshole, why didn't you do this 10 minutes ago? Thanks so much. Okay. I realize if you talk to a bank official about this sort of thing, every now and then I've complained, they always say the same thing. They say, well, there's all these government regulations, which is true. But then if you look at how the government regulations happen, essentially the banks write the regulations. They give, bribe money to the politicians. They call it campaign contributions. So they bribe the politicians, or lobbyists show up and say, here's how we'd like to be regulated. They do a little bit of negotiation, tweak it around a little bit, and pass it as law. So if you have these banks who are like regulated by systems which they kind of half create, is that a public bureaucracy or is it a private one? You can't tell anymore. And that over and over again, there's this confusion. And witchcraft is this thing that comes on you inadvertently by people like slipping human flesh into your food. See, witches are cannibals, and they eat their relatives. But what they do is they'll dose you. They'll if you go eat dinner with a witch, they'll slip some actual human meat into the real meat, and if you eat it, suddenly you become one of them, and it starts building up the secret power inside you. But then you owe them and said, well, I killed my cousin, to feed you. You're in my debt, and the only way you can pay it back is to start killing off your own relatives, and until gradually, there's none left.
Which is the segue to the other question. That is a difference, We may not have flying cars, but we have iPhones. And I think part of the shift that happens
Whoop-de-doo.
is iPhones are way more interesting than flying cars.
I completely disagree with you. I absolutely, utterly disagree. I think that are making up these utterly stupid toys that as somehow compensation. I just don't buy that at all.
I think the field of play in which we operate.
But if you have a basic income, think about it. Most rich countries employ thousands and thousands and thousands of people just to kind of make poor people feel bad about themselves. They're constantly monitoring them, telling them what a bad job they're doing at raising their children, or how are they really looking for a job hard enough, so forth and so on. Almost every aspect of your life is constantly being inspected and found wanted. The people doing that, they don't like those jobs. They're miserable, right? If you have basic income, you could both get rid of them and say, we don't care if you're good enough to have them. Everybody's good enough to have the money. You're alive. You're good enough to have the money. And then all those people who used to have to spend their lives monitoring poor people to be middle class, they'd be free too. They'd have basic income. They could go form a band or write poetry or something, and probably contribute a lot more to society than they're doing now.
One of them was that no one has ever written a history of debt, which is kind of shocking because really there aren't that many things that no one's ever written a history of. If you think about it, people have written histories of salt. People have written histories of different types of fish. There's a French historian who wrote a history of shit. It's actually human waste disposal over the years. Pretty much anything you can think of, there's a guy who's written a history of that.
Insofar as they're tricking you nowadays, they're tricking you into thinking everybody else thinks the system is fair. You see through it. You're the cynical realist, but everybody else is sheep and stupid. And everybody's thinking that of each other. And
I call it the financialization of politics, because Keynes wrote this famous essay in the 30s about the beauty contest. He said, financial markets are a little bit like a beauty contest where everybody's asked to guess who everybody else thinks is the most beautiful.
Yes, right, great. Yeah. On other people's grants, reviewing things. People have said Einstein would have been destroyed. He never could have, first of all, stuff wouldn't have been published. He never would have got to the point where he would have published it. And you look at the sort of people who are actually responsible for creative breakthroughs, not just the scientists, but the social thinkers. Like, you don't even have to talk about real weirdos like Nietzsche. What about anybody from Max Weber to Foucault, Deleuze? All these guys are kind of the heroes of the academy nowadays. None of those guys would have gotten tenure in a university. They would have been kicked out as weirdos almost immediately.
All right, and we want to talk about your tenure time in America, but we'll get to that.
It's presumably not absolutely impossible to build a robot that could take your laundry down, wash it, and bring it back again. But, this sort of research simply hasn't been done. So I think that almost everyone has grown up with this sort of secret disappointment, but also a secret shame because they feel like idiots ever having really believed that they should have this to begin with. So we can't talk about it. Occasionally you see on the internet like the flying cars issue, but it's almost a way to laugh at people. Oh yeah, you were promised flying cars.
One point you hear a lot of, actually, people say, well, we come to realize in this part of the world, demanding your own country is basically the same as saying, I demand the right to be tortured by secret policemen speaking my own language. It's not much of a demand. So they've come around to this idea of bottom-up direct democracy and sort of eliminating borders is the best way that they could come up with something like a Kurdistan that would make sense.
Madagascar is one of the last places on Earth actually to have been inhabited. There's some archaeological evidence now. There were some people tooling around earlier, but they didn't leave much long-term traces. They keep coming up with little bits of evidence implying people have been in Madagascar much earlier than that. But I always say it's an example of actually, when they talk to archaeologists, of why sexist language makes a difference. Because they're always saying, when did man come to Madagascar? There's evidence of the presence of man as far back as 200 BC, but it doesn't seem to lead to much, right? So yeah, that's because the real question is like, when women came to Madagascar. That's a bunch of guys tooling around. Those are hippopotamus, they have a party, like, so what? So women seem to have come to Madagascar in 580. But, they're always going on about how these are the freest people on Earth. And it's very interesting, which they didn't prove at all. One of the interesting things when you read this literature is the sort of reversal, because we're taught to think of this as, this is the Western gaze. The Europeans are kind of us, and they're observing these exotic people who you can't completely understand. But in fact, when you read it, it's the indigenous people are making pretty much all the arguments that we would be making if we met a bunch of Jesuits.
It's the Europeans who...
I recently wrote an essay for The Baffler. And Baffler is one of these magazines that keeps appearing and reappearing, and it's reappearing again in March. And they asked me to write a piece. And I thought, all right, I'm famous now. I guess one of the things you can do when you're famous is you can do all those things that you always really wanted to write about, but never could, because no one would take you seriously, or they laughed at the very idea. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to expand on this notion of the future that I've talked about in the Art and Immaterial Labor paper.
The people who created the systems that we now think of as democratic, and I'm most familiar with the framers of the American Constitution, most people don't know that nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about America being a democracy. In fact, the people who created that document hated democracy. They're expressly against it. If you look at, I'm not making this up, if you read the introductory speech to the Constitutional Convention, it says, we've got a problem. There's way too much democracy. A lot of the state constitutions allow really strong democratic elements. It's going to overwhelm everything. We need to control. We need to contain this.
Any functional society, almost any society that's ever existed, has something to do with brilliant, imaginative, but extremely impractical people. We don't know what to do with them anymore. We just, like, they're all living in their mother's basements saying weird things on the internet, and you can't tell which are crazy and which actually have something to contribute.
Socrates blows that one out of the water right away, of course. He says, well, okay, some guy lends me his sword, and then he goes violently insane and wants it back to kill people. Like, do I give it back? Of course not. And probably I'll make up some lie as to why I can't. So they start with that, and so, all right, not that, something else. Maybe I mean it metaphorically. And, the rest of the book is basically the, okay, not that, maybe something else then. But that, it's dead, right? And no, actually it's not. That shows up over and over and over again. In a way, all the world religions start that way too.
Breathtaking new technologies were in fact emerging. The internet, I guess. But I mean, as I always say, if you take a science fiction fan of the 1950s and show them the internet, they would have been impressed. But then if they found out that was like the best thing we'd actually managed to come up with, what would their reaction likely to have been? But, like this thing it's basically, it's fast and it's convenient, but it's basically a combination of a post office, a mail order catalog, and a library. Oh, that's it. And what about the computers you can talk to, the robots could think?
So in the case of freedom, this is most dramatic because nowadays you can't be against freedom, right? So the usual line is that personal liberty and individual freedom is obviously a value unto itself. You can't build a society entirely on that basis. There's a limit because it wouldn't work in practice. The Jesuits, were exactly the opposite. They were like, well, nobody ever takes orders from anybody else. They completely refuse it. They don't use punishment of criminals even, and it actually works really well, and there's less crime here than there is in France, but it's terrible in principle. I mean, how are they going to learn the 10 Commandments if they don't ever command each other, Giving orders is necessary. It's a moral good. So it's exactly the opposite, of the opinions that most people would have today. Absolutely, and they really did. That's why they had to invent mortgages and things like that. I'll pretend to buy your house and then rent it back to you, that kind of thing.
Actually, I sometimes ask whether I should even be using the word capitalism rather than capital, because I don't think it's a totalizing system. I do think that they're capitalists, and I do think that they meet and discuss things with each other more often than we realize. I mean, they have advertised meetings where they meet and discuss things with each other. It's not a secret. And we used to besiege them regularly, Davos. And
people ask me this all the time. They say, well, you're for the NHS, right? You're for public resources. Like, isn't that government? Well, how can you be an anarchist and be for that? And I always say, I make a distinction between institutions that could exist without violence and ones that couldn't. Any institution that could exist without ultimately being able to call up somebody with a stick or a gun to say, look, I don't care what you think, shut up and do what you're told. If you don't have recourse to that and you could still run the organization anyway, that's fine.
Okay. And
now, the fascinating thing is that this time around, we tried to do it the exact opposite way around. Here, they create the IMF to protect creditors against debtors. Sure enough, the entire world is falling into debt traps. We have a design, and people are blaming themselves. So you have to realize that, no, this is an historical phenomenon that's happened over and over again. And when I just point out to people, look, most people in history have been debtors. Does that mean most human beings who've ever lived have been vastly inadequate and should be ashamed of themselves? It's the definition of utopian system that when something goes wrong, it says there's something wrong with the people. It's all of them. Basically what we've done is we've gotten rid of the corruption problem in America by making it legal. I mean, it's true on every level. I had a friend who was applying for a visa, and they had like a little box you could check to for $25 they'd expedite your visa. It's like, usually you have to slip somebody on the sly, and it's like, here it is. So on every level, corruption has basically been legalized in America. So our entire political system is entirely based on bribery. I mean, senators have to spend
like at least a third of their time, sometimes 2/3, soliciting bribes, basically. And, you know, the people who give them the bribes then write the legislation, which then, of course, gives them the right to take even more money from people. I mean, that's basically what our economy is based on, this huge system of circulating bribes. And, I mean, in a way, that's what people are pointing out, like, when they're identifying Wall Street and the political control as part of the problem. So I think, you know, starting to use words like that would be very helpful.
Yeah, the thing that struck me about superheroes is they're an imaginative genre. They're very imaginative, right? But they're an imaginative genre whose ultimate message is suspicion against the imagination, because the only really imaginative characters are the bad guys. You know, you identify first with the bad guys. The bad guy's actually trying to do something, and then you kind of feel guilty about it and identify the guy beating up the bad guy. It's classic sort of Freudian thing going on there. And many people have talked about that. But what struck me was that, you know, here you have these guys, like, imagine you're Superman, you could do almost anything. Like, the best thing you can come up to do is fight crime. You could be carving cities out of rocks. You could be doing anything. Just imagine the things you could do if you had, like, see-through things. You could fly. You could be super powerful like that. And these guys are the least imaginative characters ever. But all they can do is they can be imaginative in terms of their clothes, their cars, and their houses, like consumption, basically, right? Whereas the only people who are trying to apply imagination on a political level are, of course, the evil guys.
In the 40s, they produced all those giant tank armies. In the 50s, they had the Sputnik. And so, you know, people actually felt that there was a genuine threat. This is why people always make the famous argument that the lunar landing was probably the greatest historical achievement of the Soviet Union, since the U.S. would never have done it otherwise. So one reason I came to be an anarchist is because I always say most people don't think anarchism is a bad idea. They think it's insane, right? You know, I mean, no police, people would just start killing each other. You know, nobody could actually organize things without leaders. You know, and in fact, my father was in Barcelona when it was run on anarchist principles. You know, they just got rid of white-collar workers, and sure enough, they discovered these were basically bullshit jobs, that they didn't make any difference if they weren't there.
Oh, I think people desire to change it all the time, but they kind of feel completely alienated from the possibility of doing so. It never really occurs to people that they could have any influence in the way bureaucracy works. Someone once pointed out in America, for example, the way people use the word us and them. You know, if you're talking about your city and you talk about street signs, you know, you say, oh, you know, look, they put in another light here, or I wish they would take that thing down. It's always them. You don't know who they are, you know. They're this. On the other hand, if like your city's sports team, you know, has a victory, it's like, we won, you know. So you identify with one, but, you know, even though these people are supposed to be your political representatives who work for you, I mean, the sports team doesn't actually work for you, you know, you see it as this alien thing that you couldn't possibly influence.
There's a certain degree, I imagine, where, I mean, obviously impersonal structures, there are some areas where you definitely want to have impersonal structures of some kind. And I don't imagine we'd ever completely get rid of that, even in a sort of libertarian socialist society. But what we have seen is that, you know, this weird dynamic for the last, at least the last century, whereby every time there's a liberal reform meant to unleash the market and get rid of paperwork, it actually creates more paperwork and more bureaucrats than existed before. My favorite statistic about this is between, I think it was 1992 and 2001, the total number of bureaucrats, civil servants in Russia increased by 25%. That was during shock therapy. The economy shrank by something like that. They ended up with more civil servants than they had under the Soviets.
A 19th century liberal meant free market guy. And the word was appropriated by, you know, the social democratic left in America, so that the right wing had to choose another one, so they stole libertarian, which originally meant anarchist, from the anarchists, and then attacked liberal, so which is why the system we now have in America is called neoliberalism everywhere in America, I mean everywhere in the world except America, where the word makes no sense to people, and as a result, on the other hand, it's telling that when you want to talk about neoliberalism in America, the only words you're allowed to use, you can talk about freedom, free market, free enterprise, or free trade. You can only refer to it with propaganda words.
So, unwittingly has recreated what is quite a sort of ancient idea that your importance depends on how many people you bring with you. I mean, I think I remember reading,
they call it managerial feudalism.
Yeah,
but they actually marched us. They kind of steered us on their own determined path, since they had such overwhelming numbers and armored vehicles and all that sort of thing. And they put us right next to the World Bank building, which we'd never been allowed anywhere near before, partly owing to the fact that the World Bank building is entirely made of glass. So here they just basically parked us next to this giant glass building and then surrounded and kettled us and wouldn't let us go for 2 hours. Sort of thinking, come on, give us an excuse. And obviously we weren't that stupid, so there's this standoff. We all sat there being very depressed, and eventually I actually called 911. I remember that. I'd never done that before. I called an emergency and said, help, help, we were being surrounded by men with guns. Come save us. Just to see what they would do. They're also so bored. Other people ordered a pizza. Eventually they let us go, and we all went home and were kind of depressed, and it was a miserable day. But what the real revelatory thing was is afterwards I talked to a friend who was actually married to someone. She had a friend who was married to someone who actually went to the World Bank meetings that were happening at that time, and all they all did was complain about how utterly miserable and horrible it was. They said, there was like 17 layers of security. There was, all the parties and the fun stuff was canceled. Half of them couldn't even get into town. They telecommuted. They all had to go through layer on layer of pat-downs and searches and electrical things. They just totally destroyed the meetings, which hardly took place. And I thought about that, and I thought, that's fascinating. Think about that. Like, the World Bank and the IMF are two of the very most powerful organizations in the entire world. And they were like, the police and general authorities were willing to shut down their annual shindig and their party and make them all miserable, just so that 2,000 anarchists could have a really bad day. They must think we're really important. And think about that. We go around thinking we're really pathetic most of the time. But, like the most powerful people on Earth, have just told the second most powerful group of people on Earth that, they should not have any fun, just make us miserable. So why is it so important for them that we're miserable? There's a famous story about this guy who would walk up and down the beach, sort of notorious glutton, who would say, wow, squid, I love squid. And he never seemed to do much fishing himself. Of course, he had to give him the squid. So he would just be raiding everybody's food day in, day out, until after about 5 years, they formed a war party and killed him. It's just actually easier just to bash a guy's head in than to say, no, I'm not going to give you the squid. All right, so it took me a long time to figure this out. And one way I figured out is reading an essay by the French anthropologist, actually, Marcel Mauss, about cultural refusal. Basically, what marks a culture is what you won't do, what you refuse to do. Because we have this idea that cultures are these little isolated pockets, and then they kind of, and there's something primordial about them. But people have been in communication with each other forever, for thousands. Back in the Paleolithic, people would just wander around hundreds and thousands of miles, and everybody's always knows all about everybody else. So the question is, why is it that not why people borrow some things from other people, but why they don't? And all over the, if you look at the ethnographic tradition, what you see is people just basically saying fuck you to their neighbors and refusing to adopt things that are often very practical. Moses' example was up in Alaska, you have Algonquians and Inuit, and the Algonquians have snowshoes, so the Inuit refuse to use snowshoes, which, if you think about it, if you're living on top of snow, is there's a lot of really good practical reasons to use snowshoes, but they're like, no, we don't like those guys, they're stupid snowshoes. And the Algonquins are like exactly the same with kayaks. It's obviously superior type of boat, but like the other guys refuse to use it. So culture has a lot to do with basically defiance.
And if you look at the history of a lot of societies that we assume to be primordial, in that context, that people actually knew each other existed, people are often defining their lives in relation to other social possibilities, you realize that politics of the kind of cultural politics that we think about as being something new has been going on for thousands and thousands of years.
Actually, the Lord's Prayer, which we always remember through the Anglican translation, which is, forgive us our trespasses just as we forgive those who trespass against us. Sort of translated into this odd private property terms. But the original Aramaic and the original John Wycliffe translation is debt. Forgive us our debts just as we forgive those who owe us money. But of course, there's kind of a message there, right? Because we don't actually forgive those who owe us money, generally speaking. So in a way, it's a way of saying, like, you're a sinner. You don't deserve anything. But in fact, grace will come and you'll be forgiven. So what is sacred isn't actually paying back debts, it's forgiveness of debts, which was a tradition, going back to ancient Mesopotamian debt forgiveness and the biblical Jubilee, which is adopted from that, where periodically debts are canceled. And that is a divine act. Everybody's got in their minds this idea of bomb-throwing anarchist. If you look at the last 50 years, anarchism is probably the only political movement whose exponents never bomb anybody. When's the last time an anarchist blew somebody up? Anything else, like conservatives, liberals, social democrats, they blow people up all the time. Right. We never blow anybody up. Where are we the bomb throwers? When you talk to Russians about this, even at the end of the Soviet Union, they had these mad schemes. They had this idea of spirulina, seeding the oceans with edible seaweed to solve the world hunger problems. And they had the Giant Energy Project, which nobody talks about in this country, where they were going to shoot hundreds of solar-powered satellites into outer space to beam energy down to Earth to solve the world energy problem. That's why they built those big booster rockets that we're still using. But
he's definitely a cartoon character. I mean, I remember looking at a crowd, like some G8 summit, and there he was, and all these people were trying to shake hands and talk to him. And it was as if, this badly drawn cartoon character had walked into a group of real people, and they all had to pretend he was real, and they're all kind of awkward and didn't quite know how to interact with him,
Right. Starting in the early 19th century, franchise was extended. People running for office suddenly some of them started calling themselves Democrats, and this happened in America. It also happened in France, eventually here in the UK, and winning elections. So suddenly everybody started calling themselves Democrats, even though it had been a bad word before. And Republican systems that were essentially created to contain democracy got renamed democracy.
28, no, it's 37%, something like that. I'm making this up, but it was around there. Said that their jobs were pointless, but only 34% said they were unsatisfied. They didn't find them satisfying. They said, aha, so there's 3% of people who feel their jobs are pointless but satisfying. Why would that be? Maybe they hate their families,
Nice people operate on credit and trust. So everybody's doing these credit transactions and everybody's keeping track in their heads. So I owe him 5 shillings, he owes him 3. And every 6 months to a year, they have what they call communal reckoning. So everybody sits down in a big circle and they say, all right, I owe you 7 shillings, he owes him 7 shillings, he owes him, he owes me. Okay, big circle, we can cancel that one out. And they just do a bunch of loops and they gradually whittle it down until they figure out there's about 3 shillings left over between this guy and that guy, and what is actually owed, and then somebody gives somebody a pig, some cheese, whatever it might be, and they settle it and go back to zero again and start. And that's community. Community means everybody owes everybody something else. Everybody remembers what they owe, and eventually they all settle it and start over again.
And I saw that phrase over and over again. Well, finance systems are ways of moving money from the idle rich to the industrious poor, because there are good poor people and there are bad poor people, and the good poor people are the ones who want to be capitalists, basically. Right. And I think that debt has allowed us to create this morality, which is perverse if you think about it, because the last thing we need in this world right now is people to work even more. People are working way too much. It's destroying the ecosystem. The growth levels that are demanded by our current economic system are clearly unsustainable. It strikes me that if there are people out there who are taking care of each other and having a reasonable life and not, sort of increasing this endless massive expansion that's destroying the world, maybe they should be considered the pioneers of a new type of economy where which actually wouldn't destroy the planet.
So let's talk. The 20th century, most historians now think the 20th century ran from about 1914 to maybe 1991. The short 20th century, they sometimes call it. Well, the 20th century was probably the most violent century in human history. It was almost entirely made up of either fighting world wars or preparing for world wars. And during that period, certainly, I would say anarchism didn't look particularly realistic, because the one thing anarchists will never be good at is building gigantic mechanized killing machines, armies. I think that's altogether to our credit. On the other hand, Marxist regimes often, that was about the only thing they were particularly good at. So they were pretty good at it.
Yeah.
But
like, they don't mind if people say, I hate you, I want to overthrow you, nearly so much as they say, you guys are ridiculous and unnecessary. That's what they really fear. So, the enemies they like are the ones who try to replace them. Marxists basically, if Marxists come, the police will still be there, and probably there'll be more of them, right? Anarchists come, the whole structures will be changed. People will be told they're just completely unnecessary. And so that kind of experiment they're really afraid of. They tend to stamp it out as quickly as possible.
And
this became an instant bestseller, right?
It was huge. It was translated into all European languages. Everybody read it. There was a play inspired by it that ran in Paris for 20 years. It was like Cats. It never went away. It was one. And so everybody.
Maybe Les Miserables would be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the more we learn about the history of North America, the more we realize, actually, there were large urban civilizations in the Mississippi Valley, which, close enough these guys clearly knew they existed, right? They might have been involved with them in some way or another. And they existed for 1,000 years, and a lot of them seem to be based on these elaborate caste systems. There was human sacrifice, there was mass warfare. Some of these were pretty nasty large states. And then, maybe 2 or 3 generations before the white settlers show up, a lot of these things fall apart, right? We don't know why. Something happens, they collapse. All right, so you get these big, nasty state-like urban institutions, they collapse. About 50 years later, foreigners show up, and they basically find this bunch of hippies. Going, we're one with nature, everybody's equal. And so it doesn't seem to occur to them maybe there's a relationship between these two things, I mean, in fact, what they encountered was presumably the revolutionary ideology of the guys who overthrew those cities. These are people who ran away from them. And to this day, people can't put 2 and 2 together. But that was 500 miles away. Yeah, people walked. All right, so culture, a lot of what we think of as culture then are actually social movements that won. What would seem ridiculous? I mean, there's people out there could probably come up with cold fusion. There's people out there that could probably come up with almost anything you can imagine. Right now, they're sitting around trying to pay off their father's debt on the rice plantation and spending all their time in a shoe factory.
They wouldn't be as important if they didn't have as many people working on them. So those are the guys still making the decisions when you say them. I mean, you always have to remember when you say, why don't they? Who are they anyway?
Who are they? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like when they're saying, why don't they fire Dominic Cummings? Well, Dominic Cummings is them.
Well, I mean, I had really bad timing in the sense that, I came out as an anthropological theorist to just the point where anthropology decided we don't like theory anymore. I came out as a proponent of direct action, and then 9/11 happened 2 weeks later. Didn't look too good. This sort of thing kept happening to me over and over. It kind of was a direct action. It's not really the kind I was talking about. Yeah. And so this kept happening to me over and over again. I just had the worst timing in the world. One of the great questions is how that comes about. Why the need to quantify promises happens, or to quantify them precisely. And we've had a story about why this happens that you read in your basic economic 101 textbook. It was actually invented by Adam Smith in 1776. The Wealth of Nations is the first time you see someone really making the argument in detail. And it continues to be the story that everybody knows and learns. They pick up somewhere or another.
it becomes common sense. And here, as an anthropologist, I must say that I have a kind of a pet peeve in this respect, because it's a professional pet peeve on the part of anthropologists, because this story was told, over 200 years ago. Almost immediately, we started going out in the world trying to find examples of people who do it, and we couldn't. It's not true. But they never changed the textbooks. We just can't get them to come up with a different story. But
from now, just like any 12-year-old knows how you kill a vampire, right? Which is kind of amazing. I remember seeing a vampire movie with a bunch of people from Eastern Europe, and they were like trying to remember, oh yeah, isn't there something about garlic, And I realized that, any 8-year-old child in America knows more about how you kill a vampire than people who are actually from Transylvania. Completely thoroughly inculcated in this mythology. And then I wondered, maybe the science fiction mythology we have is actually equally an Eastern European import, at least to a certain degree.
Seen so much security in my life. There were like squads of police, there were horse comps, there were helicopters, there was like all these shady looking undercovers, like there was sort of lurking obviously around.
Can you spot the undercover cops?
Oh yeah, it's pretty obvious.
Okay, short hair. Okay.
A lot of them wear bracelets. If they're people of color, actually, they have little colored bracelets so that other cops won't beat them up.
Wow, okay. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of stuff you learn when you do direct action. And, just from an anarchist point of view, to some degree, it is a little creepy. You go there, and there are all these pictures of the great leader. And I came to refer to him as Uncle Oj, like Uncle Joe backwards. But, he's the opposite, because he's like the authoritarian leader telling everybody to read anarchism and stop being authoritarian. And it puts the old-fashioned authoritarians in a terrible bind, right? Because, they have to do everything the leader says. The leader's saying, think for yourself.
There's like two things you never ever do if you're in an academic or professional environment. One of them is trust your superior to do the right thing, and the other one is get angry at them if they don't. What you're supposed to do is figure out what they're supposed to do, subtly make them do it by exerting continual pressure, and never get upset with them. But of course, if you come from a working class background, you don't know that because what's that? You get angry. Well, first you trust them because you assume you can trust people to actually come through for you if they're friends. And then if they don't, you get pissed off. And both of those, no, those are the things you don't do.
Does an anarchy to be an anarchist is not to respect authority?
No. I think to be an anarchist is to be critical of authority and to always examine
where authority is just by definition.
Well, no, to always examine authority critically to see if it's legitimate.
Yeah.
And I think there are forms of authority that are legitimate, but you don't worship authority as a thing in itself.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, take, I like the notion of self-subverting authority. I think there are certain types of authority which undermine their own basis, and I think those are very good, like a teacher. If you're a teacher and you teach someone very well, they know what you used to know, so there's no further basis for your authority.
Depending on how good a teacher you are. So there's no basis for what?
There's no further basis for the authority if you're a good teacher.
Yeah, yes, because you need more people to come in, because
Well, between those two people, the relationship subverts its basis.
Yeah. But
if you're a doctor and you cure someone, you no longer have any reason to have authority over that person.
And a lot of what has been going on for the last 40 years or so, since the 80s, has been to try to trick us into thinking that we're them, essentially. I noticed this in the media back in the 80s when I was very young, that I got to see the transition when all these newspapers sort of fired their labor reporters, and right around the same time, they started running the stock quotes below the screen during news broadcasts, because anybody interested in world events will clearly be an investor in the stock market. And in fact, most people are not, even through their pension funds in any way, invested in this thing. But the idea is we all own a piece of this, and the way I put it is, it's almost as if they're trying to redefine freedom as owning a piece of your own perpetual subordination.
Well, the other aspect of this is the assumption that if you do bring imagination into the political sphere, the results are likely to be disastrous. I always talk about superhero comics as actually revealing a lot of this tacitly right-wing ideology. It's kind of interesting because if you think about it, in sort of classic Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, old-fashioned sort of genre stuff, the only really imaginative characters are the bad guys, right? I mean, the only people because think about it, Superman, he could do anything, and the guy has no imagination. He's just sitting around. All he can think to do is fight crime. All these guys have these enormous powers. They could be doing like amazing things, and they never do. They just sort of intervene to like keep things kind of the same. The bad guys, they have imagination, but it always leads to sort of. So you identify with them at first, right? Because they're having fun at least and have projects and plans, but it's ultimately disastrous. So then you finally have to they're the kind of libido, and you re-identify with the superheroes who beat them back into submission. But if you think about it, they're the ones who are actually applying imagination on a cosmic or national or political scale. Whereas, like the superheroes, they can be imaginative, but it's entirely confined to what? Their clothes, their cars, their paraphernalia, basically consumption stuff. Their houses, they get to have a bat cave. So that seems to be the message, right? It's like confine the imagination to the consumer domestic sphere. That's okay. If you get imaginative outside that, disasters, death, chaos will ensue. And that's basically the essence of right-wing ideas. Essentially, the difference between conservatism and fascism, they both agree with that, right? If you unleash the imagination in the political sphere, only disaster will ensue. Conservatives, therefore, don't want to unleash the imagination in the political sphere, and fascists want to do it anyway. Which, if you think about it, like what could be more absurd than imagining debt to nature? That's one of the common ones we have nowadays. Or debt to society. It implies that you and society, which is everyone else including yourself, or you and nature, which is everything that exists including yourself, are two equal parties to a business deal. I mean, what could be more presumptuous than such an assumption? It's absurd. So what they're saying is the only way that you can pay back the debt is realize that it's absurd. There is no debt, because in order to have a debt, we would have to be equivalent to the cosmos as a whole, or to the gods, which we can't possibly be. Similarly, in the Bible, they start by saying, the Lord's Prayer, actually, forgive us our trespasses. It actually, in the original Aramaic, and even in the original Wycliffe translation, says, forgive us our debts, just as we forgive our debtors. But of course, there's a catch there, right? Because we don't actually forgive our debtors, do we? Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of a way of saying, well, you're a sinner. Why should we forgive you? But we probably will anyway. So the logic of Christianity is the same thing. They propose that there is a debt, and then they say, well, really what's sacred isn't paying your debts, but it's the forgiveness of debts.
There's a great story I always tell from New Zealand, a Maori story about a guy named Te Renga. This is a sort of notorious glutton. He rarely did much fishing himself. Everybody else in the neighborhood was a fisherman. And he would sort of walk up and down the beach looking for people coming back from fishing, and or check out their catch and say, oh, look, you got squid. Oh, I love squid. That's my favorite. Or, wow, that's a beautiful fish. And I'll be like, okay, here's a fish. Okay, here's a squid. So they just have to give it to him. After about 2 years of this, people got fed up, so they formed a war party and they killed him. It's actually easier to just bash the guy's head in than to say, no, I'm not going to give you the fish.
We doubled the amount of work people have to do through various complicated ways, whether it's work just-in-time production technologies to financialization, all these things made possible by computers. At the same time, even though we've been pouring our research money into medicine, still don't have a cure for cancer, but we do have, Ritalin and Zoloft and Prozac and all these things which basically make people not go completely insane despite the intense work regime they're now under.
Go ahead.
Yeah. It occurred to me that, Donald Trump could be imagined as the Bodie McBoatface of American politics.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's just like I agree. He's basically
person that take it seriously, ha ha ha, and basically it's a practical joke played by a certain sector of the electorate on the political class. Because what they're saying is when we see you, we see what you see when you see Donald Trump. That's basically what they're saying. This is you, greedy, narcissistic, completely corrupt, lies all the time. But you're all like that. He's just honest about it.
In a way, Corbyn's become the mainstream left. The institutional left here actually understands that you don't want to co-opt
You don't want to simply absorb the extra parliamentary left. You need to have people who are completely independent of you, creating those prefigurative spaces, opening up horizons and territories that maybe they can later move into. Also, that just make them seem more moderate in comparison. I mean, the right wing has always understood this. That's why the right is doing so well in America. I used to yell at liberals so much, and then it's like, don't you understand? Like, you can't actually screw over your radicals on policy issues if you already screwed them over on existential issues. So,
it's true.
Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah, right. Like, of course they're going to screw over the radicals on policy issues, but like they want them to be there.
So I always like the stories about Spain. They made a great impression on me. I think the one thing I really remember the most and really brought home to me was the fact that white-collar workers don't actually do anything. I think that's what I really learned from my father, from his experiences in Spain, because basically that was what they did in the Spanish Revolution, in the cities at least. They simply got rid of all the white-collar workers. And nothing much changed. Trains still ran, factories still produced things, buses still work. Turns out those guys don't actually do much of anything. That can't be done by, people on the job, in their spare half hour or hour a day.
If you look at when they talk about political corruption around the world and they have indexes, U.S. usually comes out toward the bottom. And I was always surprised by that. But then I realized, Nigeria or Russia often come out on top. Well, that's because in Nigeria and Russia, it's still illegal to give politicians money to influence their vote. In America, it's not illegal. So, of course, we don't look corrupt.
Should it be the number one?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you look at morally, I think it would be the most corrupt.
One of the ones that I always wanted to write was something about the moral and spiritual damage that's done to people by going to jobs that people know don't actually do anything. Because you meet people like that all the time. You go to parties. I mean, all my life I'd run into people and you say, well, and they say, oh, you're an anthropologist. That's really interesting. And you say, what do you do? And it's like, well, you don't want to know what I do. And if you press them, get them a little drunk, they'll start saying, well, look, I got this job, but it doesn't actually do anything. I mean, don't tell my boss, but I could easily automate this job away. Or they just kind of made it up to find this niche, and they haven't realized that it doesn't do anything.
Lockdown is just a kind of preview of what they had in store for us anyway, which is to have all our major human relationships over screens and never actually meet anybody until we're supposed to sit here and pretend to work and be isolated from each other until the seas boil and we all die. Yeah, thanks. No, the idea that society is the measure of that which has been taken away from us, and we just have to go out and recreate it. I think that process is going to happen. The form that it's going to take is something we can't entirely predict, but we should be here trying to support it in any way possible.
So such is the moral power of some customs. At any rate, so here you have, if you praise somebody, I have a friend from Lebanon said where she grew up, it was the same thing. If somebody praises your scarf or piece of jewelry, you just have to say, take it. There's only one way out, actually, which is to say, oh, you like it? It was a gift.
If the reason why we don't have robots that can take down my laundry is that 95% of all robotics research is funneled through the Pentagon, which is true. Well, why don't we have Klaatu? Why do we have gigantic killer robots shooting death rays from their eyes? Because we don't have that either. So even, the technologies that we were supposed to come up with that they were funding and that they were pushing for, by 2012, still don't exist. So how do you explain that? And I think the only way to explain that is bureaucracy. There are kind of systems such as decentralized consensus that can work without coercion, that could work without a police force. What I always say, an anarchist form of organization is any form of organization that would not require guys with weapons to show up at a certain point and say, everybody shut up and do what you're told. So any system where you don't need those guys could be an anarchist system. So what we're trying to create are decision-making methods that could work without violent enforcement. This is like the secret of all bureaucracy, right? You're supposed to rise according to your performance. Nobody rises according to their performance. If you're good at something, you're probably not going to be rewarded at all. Because you'll be embarrassing your superior. The one thing you never do in a hierarchy is embarrass your superior.
you can't rise. You don't rise according to merit, but instead you rise out of your ability to pretend that people rise according to merit. Because if you actually admit that they don't, well then fuck, you're gone, right? So they have this system where to lie, okay, well, I mean, you're not supposed, in a bourgeois environment, you're never allowed to say that somebody lied. Oh, they must have somehow convinced themselves they believed that, and like thus in meetings in these kind of environments, there's always the person who plays on it.
Then there's whole industries, like PR and lobbying that everybody knows don't really need to exist. And then if you tabulate all the people who do support work for those guys, who fix their computers, like clean their bathrooms, that's even, they're doing something, but they're doing something for people who are doing nothing. So sort of second order bullshit job.
Of course, what we learned in 2008 is that, if you're a big player, of course it can be renegotiated. I mean, it always has been that way. I mean, rich people can be incredibly kind, generous, and understanding when dealing with other rich people. When they're dealing with you, it's a little different. So what we found is they can make trillions of dollars disappear or reappear, or debts be rearranged if they really want to. They're just not willing to do it for mortgage holders.
I think something that really brought this home to me was in the 80s, there was this comedian named Sam Kinison who used to shock people by having this sketch making fun of Oxfam type charity appeals on late night television. And his big line was, he was saying, like, they're asking us to send these people food. Why don't they send them U-Hauls? I mean, and he started shouting, like, "Okay, you guys, you're living in a desert. Go to where the food is." As if this had never occurred to them, right? And I wanted to say to him, like, Sam, that's why we have border guards. Actually, most people would go to the food where the food is if there wasn't some guy who was actually there to shoot them if they tried. But we don't like to think about that. We don't like to think about the fact that the same guys who are sending the charity and laughing at the comedian are actually paying taxes to pay guys who have guns. And there's all these imaginary lines drawn around the world with not so imaginary weapons, protecting them and making sure nobody crosses.
I live in England. It used to be, since the 60s at least, every 5 years there'd be some amazing new band or musical trend that would just sweep the world coming out of England. And that's all kind of stopped since Tony Blair, really. And I asked people there, well, what happened, And everybody says the same thing. They got rid of the dole. All those guys were on unemployment. And they were squatting too, so they got rid of squatting. It used to be there'd be free housing, and you'd have a base. It wouldn't be much, but you'd have enough money that you could get your friends together with a guitar, and maybe 1 out of 1,000 of them was John Lennon, but that's enough, And now John Lennon is lifting boxes in some department store as welfare conditionality. We're never going to hear the new trend. It's all very much an experiment in democracy, and you'd think this is great. Well, as soon as they meet a real army, let's see what happens. Well, they always win. I mean, they've been completely defeating ISIS systematically on the ground, and at the moment they're marching on the ISIS capital.
So we've all got each other's.
Right. So, all right. Here you have the situation. So I want a cow. I go up, I say, wow, that is one magnificent cow. It's a really beautiful cow you got there. So the guy, there's only one thing he can do. He says, oh, you want the cow? Well, oh no, please take the cow. It's a really stupid cow, but if you like it, you should really have it. No, don't even think about giving me anything back. It's a gift, of course. We were neighbors. We love each other. Just take the cow. Now, he owes you one. And everybody knows that. Nobody will say it. But what does he owe? He owes you something roughly like a cow. And that's what you get in communities like this. You get this sort of rank system of types of things. So a cow, a canoe, a very nice necklace are roughly the same. You could give one back for the other. Or, it's not necessarily that, because you could give something back to him, or he could just show up because, you owe him one, and he could just say, well, wow, that's a beautiful necklace you have. Or you could say, my son is deeply in love with your daughter. It could be a lot of things. It isn't necessarily a material good. I really need help for something.
But the crazy thing is the moralization of that. And you see this sort of populist rage, especially in the United States, but you see it here too, against people who get to have jobs that do something. Teachers is a great example, and this might tie back to the education thing.
I actually heard there was a right-wing organizer who read this piece and said, yeah, it's really true. We started, because I said, why are people mad at teachers when the problems are caused by the school administrators, and nobody ever gets mad at them? And this guy said, yeah, it's true. We started trying to blame the school administrators. It didn't really take. And when we started talking about teachers, everybody got really mad at them. So there seemed to be some sense that, well, you guys get to do real work. You teach people things. You're shaping young lives. Isn't that enough for you? You want like good benefits and retirements too? And even car makers, you get to make cars. That's a real job. So there's a sense if you're doing something real, you shouldn't be paid. There's a famous astrophysicist named Jonathan Katz wrote an essay called Don't Become a Scientist, where he sort of described what happens nowadays. You have to spend much of your time being someone's flunky. But even once one isn't, he says, you're going to spend your time writing proposals rather than doing research. And because your proposals are judged by your competitors, you cannot follow your curiosity. You have to spend your time and efforts and talents anticipating and deflecting criticism rather than solving important scientific problems. It is proverbial that original ideas are the kiss of death for a proposal because they have not yet been proved to work. So I think, there you go. That's why we don't have flying cars. That's it. He just told you.
In fact, this can be tested. There have been times or places where police have disappeared. And even in modern cities, actually my favorite example, apparently at one point during World War II, the Nazis arrested the entire Amsterdam police force. And just took them all away. So there were just no police in Amsterdam for a year. And almost nothing changed. Yeah. Property crime went up because they were professional burglars, but their violent crime didn't change at all. So yeah, people don't actually need this stuff.
Okay. When the time came that the cops came in, we expected they would raise a huge fuss about the violence, about repression. I mean, essentially, the First Amendment is pretty clear. It says Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech, freedom of the press, or freedom of assembly. And everybody says, well, you have the right to freedom of assembly, you just have to ask the cops first. It's like, no, if you have to ask the cops before you speak, that's called not having freedom of speech. If you have to ask the cops before you print something, that's called not having freedom of the press. Why is it different with assembly? But they basically said, oh, well, First Amendment, whatever.
What's that?
Yeah, communism is it's like queer, let's take it up and throw it back at them.
Right. No, I think that's
actually another piece I wrote, the flying cars one that I mentioned. That was my ultimate conclusion for why we don't have teleportation devices and anti-gravity sleds and all those things. Is all the scientists are spending all their time assessing one another and assessing one another's grant applications. I mean, it's about 50% of the scientist's time is just spent with paperwork.
As Malatesta used to point out, if you say that anarchists are crazy people who are just against everything, all people who are crazy people who are just against everything will start to call themselves anarchists. That doesn't actually mean much about what the other ones, who are always calling themselves anarchists, will say.
It was because I thought I was safe. I thought I was finally in a position where it was okay. I remember this. I had this moment. I had this bougie girlfriend, and I don't know why I'm saying this, but what the hell? This is when I had a job at Yale. I got the bougie girlfriend, and everything's doing well. And I actually showed her Columbo, which had been my favorite show when I was a kid, and she'd never seen it before. And it's about this guy who's working class, and he's like smarter than everybody else, but he's got these mannerisms, and he's like. And she saw this and she said, oh, now I understand. Oh, that's why you're always doing that thing where you scratch your nose. And I always wondered about that. And it's like, I see. So you were like the working class kid who was so too smart for your own good. So you were really worried that people would notice. So you did all these off-putting mannerisms so they wouldn't notice or be threatened by you. Oh, you don't have to do that anymore, David. It's okay. She said, no, you're okay. You've arrived. You're a professor at Yale. You can relax now. You can say what you really think. You're safe. So I did, and anyway, the rest is history. Trains still ran, factories still produced things, buses still worked. Turns out those guys don't actually do much of anything that can't be done by, people on the job, in their spare half hour or hour of the day. Mainly they're just there to make you feel bad about yourself in various ways.
All right, so it all comes to a peak, and this is like the smoking gun. This is, I'm really pleased I found this, by a woman named Madame Givenchy.
Graffini.
Graffini, no, why did I call Givenchy? Sorry, Graffini, Madame de Graffini.
In order to be taken seriously by the international community, by aid people, by other powers, you have to have something that looks like a government. So they set up something that looks just like a government. It's got a parliament, it's got ministers, it's got all that stuff. You go to the office, you can get forms, and they'll stamp documents for you. Internally, they don't do that. When I sort of test case the last time I was there, I was like, are they really serious when they say they aren't a state? Was what do they do about cars? Turns out you don't need a driver's license. They only give you license plates if you're intending to leave the area. And they do have traffic cops, but you know what they do? They're basically there to pull kids out of cars. Say, hey, you're 8, you can't drive.
It becomes almost as if people start to feel that if your job does something, you don't deserve very much in the way of pay, because after all, you get fulfilling work. I mean, what more do you want? Or shouldn't be paid at all. A lot of people work for corporations where they say, well, a translator, I don't need to pay a translator. People like to translate things. There's always, if there's something that's in any way fulfilling as work or meaningful or actually helps people in some way, you really shouldn't have to pay them for it. And the same corporations, of course, are hiring all these executives who do nothing other than writing reports to send to committees to people who write reports.
But you have this sort of quantified rank system. And there's all sorts of ways you can head it off. You can play games. You could say, oh, I hate owing that guy a cow. I know, I just got a whole bunch of yams. I'll give them to him. I'll be off the hook. And, he'll be like, oh, yams, great, thanks.
The ruling class doesn't actually identify with the people in any place that they're in. And this tends to be the case everywhere. The very first explorers who came to Madagascar, actually, Portuguese explorers, came to this place, the Antemoro Kingdom. The first that people came out to meet them, and first thing they said, well, so are you from this island? They said, no, of course not, no. We actually come from Mangalore and Mecca. And there's been this huge literature ever since trying to figure out who these guys actually were and what kind of migrations must have been going on. And of course, Madagascar was a center of all sorts of trade, and there were people coming from all sorts of different places all the time. But it's pretty clear that these guys just just made up the largest and most distant 2 cities that they'd actually heard of. The point is, we are not from here. Do not mistake us with these natives. We are the ruling class. We eat off nice plates. We're guys like you. And generally speaking, wherever explorers would go in the world, they would meet people like that. Would say, oh, come on, those confuse us with these peasants. We come from far away. I'm not quite sure where, but. Someplace doesn't. Ruling classes always come from someplace else.
Because if you want to actually, come up with an unexpected breakthrough, what do? You get a bunch of creative people, you give them whatever they want, whatever resources they need, and you leave them alone for a while, and you come back, and most of them aren't going to come up with anything, but 1 or 2 are going to come up with something you never would have imagined. If you want to make absolutely sure that innovative breakthroughs never happen, what you do is you say, okay, none of you guys get any resources at all unless you spend most of your time competing with one another to convince me that you already know what you're going to discover. So there we go.
If we're talking about the problems of poverty in the global south, let us imagine that all of those lines were erased. We decided overnight, no more border controls, everybody can live wherever they want. Anybody in Tanzania or Honduras can go to Antwerp or California or wherever they want to go. Well, don't you think that the people running the wealthy countries in the world would decide then that their top priority was to come up with ways to make people in Honduras and Tanzania more inclined to stay there? You don't think they would come up with something? There's all sorts of ideas they'd come up with really fast.
off a little more?
We thought that they would know that it was in their interest that we continue to exist.
Okay.
Maybe they didn't back us. Basically, you can't sell out your radicals on policy issues if you've already sold them out on existential issues, is the way I always put it. This remains true throughout history. I mean, I was actually going through just recently some of the writings of John Adams and others of the founding fathers, their reflections on democracy, which of course they were totally against. Those guys hated democracy. And John Adams has this quote saying, well, we can't have majority vote. If we had majority vote, then we got 2 million people with property, 9 million people without property. What's going to happen? Moment we allow everybody to vote, first thing that's going to happen is they'll cancel the debts. After that, they'll redistribute the land. It's just common sense.
It's later remembered as the first book which suggested the idea of the welfare state. But she says at one point, well, why don't they just do like the Incas and take a little bit of everybody's and redistribute it? It would be a lot more rational. Which is fascinating, because nowadays you constantly read people saying, well, this idea of the Incas having some kind of welfare state is a projection of European categories onto them. Well, actually, it might be the other way around.
One of the most bitter memories I have from school is I remember when I was in a physics class, and this was junior high school, whatever they call it now. And they were talking about, I learned from Einstein the universe is finite. They taught us that. And I thought, wait a minute, the universe is finite. That means there's a finite number of matter in it. So therefore, there's only a finite number of possible positions those could take. So that means given an infinite amount of time, you'd get to the same point you've been eventually. And that means if causation is consistent, then it would repeat. So the time must go in circles. That would make sense. And I proposed this to my teacher, and they looked at me like, go read Hawking's. I don't think Hawking's existed, but there was something like that at the time. And they just completely wouldn't engage with me. I thought, but isn't that true? And I could, for years, I couldn't get anybody to respond to this. So later I was in college, and someone was explaining that Nietzsche actually proposed this. And I was like, really? Oh my God, what a smart guy.
Okay, so I came from a background where, well, why not be an anarchist? It seems plausible enough. And so I thought of myself as one, but it didn't really mean much. Occasionally I'd try to get involved. This is the 80s. Maybe I just had bad luck in what I tried to hook up with, because it was my experience that a lot of the people I met were kind of jerks. It seemed like, I always called the Bob Black period of anarchism. It was a period where everybody seemed to be this little sectarian party of one person yelling at each other. And I would kind of go and be disturbed, and after a few days leave again. So I never got involved, but I decided to become an anthropologist. I ended up going to Madagascar for one reason or another. And by sheer coincidence, kind of, I stumbled into a place where the state had in fact disappeared. I was living in an anarchist society. But the fascinating thing is it took me a while to figure it out. People had warned me at first, well, I hear the state authorities disappeared in a lot of the countryside, you should look out. So I went off, and I was in a small town, which was also in the surrounding countryside. But, the town was like an hour's drive out of the capital. It's hardly out in the boonies anywhere. And, there was government offices, there were people in the government offices typing things. There was a police station, a gendarme station, and various other state facilities. So it seemed obvious there was a government here. But as time went on, I realized there was something kind of weird going on here. Actually, I think what gave it away is I heard this story about this guy named Henri, who was this enormous, scary guy who was either insane or pretending to be insane. People seem to have mixed opinions on this one, but all agreed that he was terrible, and he would, he was violent, he would beat people up, he was sexual assault, he would steal things and take things and dare people to do something about it. So eventually people thought something needed to be done about this guy. And this is a town of 10,000 people, right? And as I learned, there seems to be this sort of basic principle in Madagascar that if you want to lynch someone, you have to get their parents' permission first. If you think about it, make sure it really doesn't happen very often. And if it does, there's probably a very good reason. So basically, it's a way of ensuring that, your dad can go, or your mom can go up to you and say, "Look, kid, you really better clean up your act." I don't know how much longer I can front for you here. All right. So after about 3 tries, his father said, "To hell with it, whatever. You're right. The guy's crazy. It's impossible." So they kind of sort of Frankenstein. They came at him with agricultural implements, and he was injured and immediately ran into the local Catholic church and demanded sanctuary. He said, "Help, help, I'm being persecuted, I'm mentally ill." And the priest, they were going to come in after him there. So the priest eventually loaded him into the back of a van and took him off to an insane asylum, where they kicked him out 3 days later for beating up the other patients, but he never came back, so it kind of worked out. But be this as it may, when I was hearing the story, I suddenly realized, wait a minute, there's like a police station right over there, Why didn't they do something about it? And they were like, "Yeah, but have you seen Henri? He's enormous." I don't want to fight him. They have guns, They're not going to shoot him. Come on. So there seemed to be this idea that, it really wasn't any of their business. And I eventually figured out the police basically were there to keep the highway open. And they wouldn't go off the paved road. So what this meant is, unless you're actually in the town itself, first of all, nobody was paying any taxes, police would not come. The paved road is very limited. And even in the town, they wouldn't do much. The idea that somehow working class people don't have that is part of the great lie. In fact, if you think about it, all of the great cultural innovations of the 20th century are basically things that were made up by working class people when they weren't working. This is true. I mean, think about it. All genres of music. Has any bourgeois people ever come up with anything particularly creative in terms of music? All genres of, all types of food, street, any kind of good ethnic cuisine, nice food you can get, it all comes from working class people from different countries. I mean, it's elites don't make that stuff up. Basically all the good stuff comes from working class people, and it gets appropriated. And there has been this move intellectually to try to not just to denigrate working class people, but to deny them that cultural responsibility. First of all, by saying they don't exist. There's this line, "Oh, working class people used to work in factories, now we don't have factories, so there are no working class people anymore." What the fuck? What do you mean? Who are these people making the houses and streets and keeping everything running? I mean, they're somehow not working class because there's because your light bulb's made somewhere else. That kind of thing was the sort of last gasp of of poetic technologies. Their defeat has led to the dominance of a complete inversion. What we now have are what I would call bureaucratic technologies, and the internet is a perfect example. But everybody says, "Well, we still have creativity. We have the internet. It's very creative." We still have technological unleashing of people's dreams. But what is it actually to do? Basically, what happens is we have people using all sorts of creative energies and insights and innovation to create ever better platforms to fill out forms. So imagination now exists in the service of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy which thus encompasses every aspect of our lives. I mean, even right before I gave this talk, I got these. 3 different pieces of paper I have to sign and fill out in order to get paid. Now, I'm guessing that when Max Weber gave talks, in Heidelberg in 1910, he didn't actually have to fill out 3 forms. And they were Germans. I mean, they were supposed to be the worst, right? He's like, somehow this has happened to us and we don't even notice it anymore, So in this story, the great Malagasy myth you hear over and over again is this Tubu cycle. It's like the cycle that everywhere you go in Madagascar, there's some version of this. And it's about the guy who claims he wasn't created by God.
I'll give you a short version of one of them, just to give you a flavor so you can have a sense of it's like, all right, there was this guy who was, became convinced that he was not created by God. And he was upset by the idea that people didn't recognize it. He wanted God to recognize that God had not created him. So he built this gigantic fire where people normally build sacrificial altars and sacrifice oxen. He built this huge fire, put more and more wood on, so the smoke went into heaven, and everybody in heaven was choking because there was too much smoke. God got upset and sent down a messenger, some big bird, said, "What's going on here? My kids can't breathe up there, like, cut it out." And said, "Well, I was not created by God. I want God to come down here and acknowledge this." So God throws down a thunderstorm, puts out the fire, but he builds, he hid the fire in a cave, built a new one. This happens a few times. Finally, the messenger said, "We'll give him some tests." And the tests, actually, they're kind of weird tests. They have to do with things in heaven being identical. He comes in and brings God's cane, which is exactly the same, top and bottom. He sort of throws it here and says, which is the top and which is the bottom, and he immediately identifies which is which. So God sends down 3 cows from heaven. One is a mother, one daughter, one granddaughter. They look exactly the same. You can immediately tell. Finally, God sends his mother, his wife, and his daughter, who also look exactly the same. Since everything in heaven looks exactly the same. He can tell. So finally God comes down in person and says, "Okay, you're a pretty smart guy. How are we going to resolve this thing?" They come up, they discuss it for a while and say, "All right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a contest of magic and trickery. And if you can do an illusion that tricks me, then I will admit that you created me. And if I can trick you," he says to God, "then you'll have to admit that you never created me." And God says, "Okay, sounds fair." So they go off, walk down the road, and each sort of scoot ahead and turn into something. At first he turns into a lovely fountain surrounded by fruit trees, and it's a really dry day, and God's walking along, he's tired, he's hot. Thirsty, he sees the fountain, he's about to drink, he says, no, that's you, you're not fooling anyone. I'm sorry. All right, that one didn't work. So they do it again. God goes ahead and turns into a beautiful field of rice with lots of geese and nice vegetables and things. And he's tired and hungry, and he's about to eat, and says, wait, no, that's you, God. That's all right, got me on that. They do this for a while, and finally he turns into a pleasant and well-designed village on a hill full of wealthy and attractive inhabitants. And God at this point needs to go to sleep. He's really tired. The sun's going down. He sees the village. He asks the headman if there's a guest house. The guy says sure. As it turns out, the headman has 3 beautiful daughters, and God falls in love with the youngest daughter, and they get married. So they live there for a while until she gets pregnant rather quickly. And it's typical of many places that pregnant women can kind of boss people around. Their husbands around asking for various types of food and delicacy. She says, I got this weird idea. I want to eat rat meat. And God says, why? He says, I don't know, it's just a craving. Could you get me some rats? So he turns into a cat, goes under the house, brings him some rats. Says, just fry it up with a little garlic and oil, and he does. And then she says, I don't know, I really want you to eat it, actually. Says, okay, dear, whatever you say. And a few days later, she gives birth, and the baby immediately jumps out of the womb and walks up to him and says, ha, gotcha. And not only that, I made you eat rats, didn't I? And God is very upset by this, and doesn't know what to say or do, so he kind of wanders off, goes back to heaven, and tries to forget the whole incident ever happened. But every now and then he remembers and gets upset and throws lightning at the earth.
Gods don't. So at first they thought, it'll be like the Tea Party, we'll incorporate them, we'll get them. And this has always annoys me. They're like, people are still, you meet these sort of moderate left, they'll say, well, you Occupy people, you should have run political candidates, you should have supported campaigns, you shouldn't have stayed aloof from politics, it's all your fault, I really oppose your decision. And it's like, excuse me, we don't tell you what to do. We became big because we rejected the political process because everybody thinks it's illegitimate. We're supposed to do what you can't do. Nobody's stopping you from going out and running for, your political candidates and campaigning for them. It didn't work, did it? And we did something that did work. So you want us to stop because you can't do what you want to do?
But people are.
And so, for example, in the Middle East, checks are invented and widely used. Already in Basra, around 800 or 900, people were reporting a majority of transactions in the marketplace are by check. Check is actually an Arab word, meaning check. Yeah, I always like to point out to people when they talk about financial globalization as if this is somehow a new phenomena. Like, think about the terms cash and checks. Cash or check. Check is an Arab word meaning check, and cash, well, it's a double etymology, but one of them apparently is originally a Tamil word for Chinese money. How did that happen?
And she's actually considered, this book is considered something of a feminist milestone because it's the first book with a female protagonist where the female protagonist doesn't either marry or die at the end.
I mean, the thing about Theresa May is she's kind of a terrible candidate. She's a very unlikable person. She's basically a robot. She can't interact with anybody. This is why she's terrified to actually, debate anyone. She misdoes the cues. She can read a speech quite well. So I would say urge people, show up in a chicken suit every time she shows up anywhere and shame her into actually debating people about issues. As soon as people are exposed to who she is, I think her vote will collapse.
It's a dematerialization. Someone told me that I had written a piece where I talked about how artists were a kind of mock proletariat for the financial sector, and at least they have these skills, and someone said, well, yeah, maybe they used to be, but increasingly, artists don't even teach you how to do welding or sort of material techniques. They assume that you'll hire someone else to do that. So increasingly, artists are just trained to be executives.
I mean, the question, of course, that people say is who has time to go to all those meetings? Who has time, to? Is there an answer to that isn't just, alienation is bad? It makes you think that you can't do things.
I think that in places where there is a long-standing tradition of direct democracy, there's two ways of doing that. Either you reduce working hours. I mean, either you do have more time and you make it fun and people want to do it, which is the technique used in many traditional societies. They have fun rhetoric. When I was in Madagascar, I mean, the rhetoric was considered so entertaining and so much fun that people would do little sets in between music, if there's a concert.
So that big kind of sense of a thick social movement rather than sort of
Yeah, it's beautiful, it's poetic, it was fun.
Democratic,
wow,
sublime.
How you really put that guy down, but it was subtle, that kind of thing.
And you have massive changes that were accomplished through these religious movements, often on the grassroots level without the people on the top of them even really entirely approving. And that's one of the fascinating things. One thing that it's really intrigued me was the first abolition of slavery in Europe. It happened twice, abolition. I mean, it wasn't completely wiped out at the end of the Roman period and the beginning of the Middle Ages, but it was mostly wiped out, 95%. And you get, you go from a period where in maybe 200 AD, 40% of the population of Italy were chattel slaves, to a situation 500 years later where nobody was. Well, how did that happen? Because we think of it as a decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the Dark Ages, like nothing good. But if you were a slave, obviously it looked a lot better. A lot of people were liberated somehow, and we just don't have the record. But it clearly had something to do with Christianization. But since almost none of the church fathers were actually against slavery, it couldn't have been official church policy. But there was some sort of thing happened within the process of the sort of religious mobilization on the grassroots that managed to completely eliminate slavery, and that happened across Eurasia, actually.
Predictable step. So when they see Occupy, I think a lot of people were like, okay, and now you should do an X, what we expect. But
which is, of course, what they've been telling us to do for 30 years, and people kept trying to do, and it always failed. Then somebody tries to do something else, it's amazingly, spectacularly successful, and they're like, yeah, that's fine, but now switch to doing what we told you all along. In Islam in particular, in this period, you get the first real free market ideology. And this is a fascinating thing. I mean, a lot of people will be very annoyed to learn this, but Adam Smith actually got most of his best ideas and best lines from medieval Islam. Like the pin factories actually comes from Al-Ghazali in 1100. He had a needle factory. No? Okay. And it's made possible by what? By Sharia, because Sharia is civil law that operates outside the purview of the state. And as a result, you can have markets, and since they get rid of usury, that's the other thing that happens. Instead of debt cancellation, which is continued in China, but in other places, they instead just get rid of interest taking. It's illegal. Debt peonage becomes illegal. And so in Islam, since they don't have that, they can have these markets that operate completely outside of the purview of the state. You could write a check in Mali and cash it in Indonesia, and it's all civil courts that take care of it. So it's the first time you really get an idea that markets run by themselves and don't really need governments. But since they are have a real free market, which isn't enforced by the state, they don't assume it's all about competition. That's like a minor element. The assumption is that it's all really an extension of mutual aid. In that sense, anarchism isn't against organization. It means people don't have to be compelled to organize themselves. Sure. In fact, they believe in organization more than anybody else.
Okay, because actually, the thing that I was wondering was, what are your tidbits on your tips on?
But the fascinating thing was they'd set it up in such a way that you wouldn't know until you'd lived there for a while that there was no state operative in this area. Because there are people who seem to work for the government. Later I learned that they weren't really being paid, and they even had to buy their own paper to fill out the forms, because the government was basically providing nothing. But they were keeping up appearances, But part of the idea, I guess, there's this sort of traditional mode of resistance. Malagasy are masters of passive resistance. So these guys figured out that, under the French colonial period, for example, they were trying this sort of thing. Their basic approach is, if somebody shows up and wants you to do something you really don't want to do, the first line of defense is be nice to them, give them coffee, agree with everything they say. When they go away, pretend the incident never happened. What? Look, guy, no, nobody came through telling us anything. There's layer on layer of defense that these guys have developed. Exclusively through utopianism of this sort. I'll give you a reason why I think this. J.P. Morgan Chase, largest bank in America, I think it's the most profitable firm. Anyway, it's up there. 85% of their profits in the last year that I checked came from fees and penalties. Think about that. So basically what they do is they make up a set of rules that they know you can't follow, and then they punish you for not being able to do it right. That's how capitalism now works. Like credit card companies, they set it up. If you actually balanced your books, they wouldn't make any money, right? It's entirely based on creating rules that imagine an idealized, perfect businessman that doesn't actually exist, and telling you that if you don't live up to that, it's your fault. There's something wrong with you, and they're going to take away some of your money. That is the major driving force of capitalism. I would say that is a decaying system, if that's all they've got, and all that they got now is the cultural logic pinning it up. It's based increasingly on naked force and naked extraction, because if you're just taking money in fees and penalties, that doesn't work unless you got the army, the bailiffs, the police on your side. The state and the capitals are fused together into one engine of extraction held up only by cultural means. And if we can reverse that, the whole thing will come tumbling.
I've never heard of.
Yeah, no, and I mean the
well, there were 5,000 occupations, and there were 3 broken windows? The average mildly rowdy hockey game in Canada has more broken windows on one night than we did during the entire movement.
Yeah, no,
nothing. It was absolutely nothing.
Right, but there was police violence, right?
Oh, yeah.
We spend more time filling out forms than any population in human history. I remember seeing somewhere that the average American spends 6 months of their life waiting for the light to change. How much of our lives we spend doing paperwork, I can't even imagine. It's a really substantial chunk.
I remember I was in watching one of those new Star Wars movies, the really bad ones, and I was thinking, well, this is a bad movie, but the special effects are amazing. I was thinking, well, remember those clumsy science fiction special effects from the 1950s? If the people from back then could watch this movie, I bet they'd be really impressed. And then I realized, No, they wouldn't, because they thought we'd actually be doing this stuff by now, you know, rather than coming up with these amazing ways to simulate it. They would be like really bitter and angry. You're not on the moon, you just come up with better movies to make believe you're on the moon. Computer programs, and I realized, simulation, end of history, nothing new. Oh, now I get it. The reason why we have these ideologies that, you know, history has come to an end, I mean, we wouldn't be saying this if we were actually on Mars. You know, it's just a sort of way of coming to terms of the fact that we can't acknowledge that we actually thought we'd be doing all this stuff that now we're just doing virtually.
And it's so frustrating to me. I often have people within Occupy who are convinced that I was the guy demanding that, like, there's a rule book of consensus, because I'm for consensus. I mean, I'm not for absolute consensus. Modified consensus, there always has to be something to do. There's always been one or two people who are crazy or unreasonable or something. So, you know, everything within reason, including reasonableness. But the
polls always show the same thing, that everybody loves democracy, hates politicians, and is kind of dubious about the very idea of government. But think about it, like, if democracy means electing politicians to run the government, how could that possibly be true? Clearly, democracy must mean something else to people. They're just not quite sure what it is.
Money is just a promise that we make to each other. It's just a set of IOUs and social arrangements. You know, those can always be rearranged. Make a promise to someone, circumstances change. You negotiate, and you know, the big players always do that with each other, as we've discovered in 2008, when, you know, trillions of dollars of debt was made to disappear by the waving of various types of magical wands. So, you know, I think what people are saying is, well, if democracy is to mean anything now, it means that everybody gets to weigh in on what sort of promises are made, what sort of promises are kept, and when circumstances change, what sort are renegotiated. And I think that's the political moment that we're in right now. Basically saying, okay, the future is gone, we have to come up with something else now. But in a way, that very dilemma reveals something that we can't actually get over it, because, you know, we still have this idea of being post something. We're just running out of things to be post of. You know, okay, we got rid of modernism, we got rid of structuralism, we're just going to try to come up with everything. So it's always like, I've got a new idea about why new ideas don't really happen anymore. There's this endless sort of cycle.
Whose life is entirely dependent on stability and time. Because, you know, rich, powerful people live in history, everything's flexible, poor people can't really plan ahead because their lives are too precarious. Middle class are the people who can kind of guarantee that if I invest in this, you know, getting a degree in orthodontics for my child, then in 30 years I'll have this income. So it's all about, you know, projecting yourself in time. And those guys basically, you know, don't really like the capitalist system very much, but when the crisis comes, they sort of hold their nose and do what they have to do to patch it back together again. So essentially that's what happened dramatically at that moment. Everybody said, no, stop thinking that. You know, everything will go crazy if we start doubting things. There's nothing to see here, nothing to see here. Just close your eyes. Yeah.
But nonetheless, you know, there'll be some people thinking I'm the rule book guy and other people saying I'm the crazy anarchist rip up all the rules guy, which maybe that shows I'm hitting the right point in the middle. But, you know, yes, there is a tendency for creeping bureaucratization to set in, and there's various reasons for that. I've actually, one of the things I was interested in looking at in the book is why that happens. Language is a great example of this. You know, first, on the one hand, languages are always changing. There's no language on Earth that's the same as it was 100 years ago. Why is that? Well, people like to play around. Everybody's always, you know, like doing it a little different or having fun with it a little, and, you know, gradually, you know, things, you know, it doesn't matter if you're in Sweden or New Guinea or Ecuador or any place else, so people like to have fun. They'll play around with the language. But on the other hand, if you tell people they're doing it wrong, they'll believe you. So if you take a rule book, you know, for how language was in 1910 and say, look, you've corrupted the language, they'll say, oh my God, you're right, you know, teach us how to speak right. You know, they'll all use slang and slack off and, you know, come up with funny new ways of talking, and then they'll believe you if you say that they shouldn't be doing that. And in a way, this is the fundamental dilemma that makes bureaucracy possible.
So you mean, for example, language is something which happens to have rules, and if somebody comes in and says there's
but the rules are changing all the time.
Right.
politicians say, well, we promise you free education, we promise you this, we promise you that, and they get elected and say, well, that was unrealistic, the government owes all this money. They're saying, like, a promise that we make to bondholders is sacred. A promise we make to the public, well, come on. I mean, that's just made to be broken. And if you challenge people on that, right, what are they going to say? They'll say, well, of course that makes sense, because, I mean, if you break your promises to bondholders, if people who lend money and they won't get the money back, well, they won't be as willing to lend, and then, the economy will suffer, right? Yeah, but if politicians constantly break their promises to voters, people will be less willing to vote, and the democracy will suffer.
I mean, almost even the avatars of capitalism say, well, it's really a great system, but unfortunately it's doomed. And usually the reason is revolution. I used to live in Chicago, and there's this incredibly beautiful street in northern Chicago where you have all these 19th century mansions. And someone explained to me that the reason why is it's on the road to the nearest army base, because all of the late 19th century capitalists were so convinced that the revolution was going to happen any week and they'd all be hanging from trees, so they sort of relocated to the place where they could most easily evacuate. So capitalists lived with this idea that it was really not going to last for that long, for much of the history of capitalism. The moment you get to the point where it's no longer plausible, basically after World War II, it's kind of hard for these people to imagine they're all going to get killed, or that the system is going to come to an end through some sort of grandiose revolution. What do we get? Nuclear war. So everybody thinks we're all going to die in a generation or two anyway. The moment nuclear war no longer seems plausible, global warming. So there's always something about to destroy us all, and it has been the case. Capitalists have never really believed the system is going to be around forever.
In any example of successful long-term democracy I know, some people don't show up. There's usually actually a core of maybe about a third of the people, like in a kibbutz or something like that, who just they're the process junkies, they're the political guys, and but they're acting in the knowledge that if they do something people don't like, those people will show up at the next meeting, whether no matter how lazy they've been up till now. So in a way, they have to bear everybody else's interests in mind because they don't have the right to represent. I have heard recently, I didn't know this, they didn't tell me, that the Boston Consulting Group, which I guess is Jeffrey Sachs's people, ran a model to see what would happen if they actually did a jubilee. And they said that it would cause severe economic disruption, but rather less than you would get if you don't have a jubilee. So either way, we're screwed, but you'd be a little less screwed if we did it that way. So it turns out that it might not be a bad idea.
In America, the radical left has allies with the mainstream left. I mean, as soon as anybody threatens Second Amendment gun laws, the entire Republican establishment goes crazy. They don't like those militia people. They think they're insane, but they want them around because it makes them seem like a reasonable alternative. And the the Democrats in America have not learned this simple lesson that you can't betray your radicals on policy issues if you've already betrayed them on existential issues. So if they got as excited about the First Amendment as the Republicans got excited about the Second, we'd still have been there. But they assumed that we were going to join the political process. In a weird way, Rousseau invented both the right and the left in two different essays for the same contest. The first one he won, the conservative one. The second one he lost. So, when I meet people at parties, I would often say, oh, I'm an anthropologist, what do you do? And they'll say, well, actually I'm the senior East Coast vision manager for this. We write reports and then have meetings and give them to other people who have meetings about the reports. A huge percent of the workforce, I thought, 20, 30%, where it's sitting there every day thinking, I'm not actually doing anything. I hope nobody figures it out. I mean, how could you have dignity in labor if you personally believe your job shouldn't really exist?
Essentially money nowadays is credit. I think people argue that 98% of dollars don't correspond to any economic value that exists now, but correspond to an economic value people imagine will exist in the future. Which actually makes the whole idea of neoliberalism, where you're supposed to provide credit for everybody so everybody participates in the capitalist game, as a way of democratizing the system. It becomes this strange system where freedom means being able to own a piece of your own, sort of permanent exploitation. But
be this as it may.
And become sort of left-wing Tea Party. And so for a while, suddenly there was insane media. I've never seen anything like it. I remember there was this case where there was this guy named Tony Baloney. He's a notorious for always
great name.
Yeah, he always pepper sprays protesters. He's been doing it in New York for like practically a decade. Everybody said, "Oh no, Tony Baloney's man, he's a sadist. He just does this." And police have impunity. There was a scene where I'd heard, there was this terrible national scandal. These protesters got pepper sprayed in Occupy, and looking at the TV, and I saw this guy sauntering up, and just the way he moved and his shape, I said, "Hey, that's Tony Baloney." Sure enough, it was, and this time it was a national scandal. He'd done it like dozens of times. People I knew.
And it didn't work that well under the French. Suddenly, when the French government went away, it was working better and better. The IMF was basically cutting the budget. They just simply cut police to the rural areas as they figured people were running their own affairs anyway. They weren't getting any taxes out of it to speak of even before that. What eventually happened was that the government effectively dissolved, but they were still playing this game of making this sort of tacit deal like, we will never embarrass you and make you feel like you're an important person who has authority as long as you don't actually try to exercise it in any way. And so everybody was playing along this illusion of the state that didn't actually exist. So it was an interesting test case in a lot of ways. In fact, I find it a very compelling argument to use to people, again, who one of the most common arguments against anarchism is that, you can't get police because people will just start killing each other. This is considered self-evident, right? No evidence needs to be produced. Well, actually no, this can be empirically tested, and that doesn't happen. I mean, there was a case, police went away, nobody killed each other, any more than they did before, which isn't very much. Pretty nonviolent society. And I think there's many places in the world like this, by the way. Where states have disappeared, but we don't know because, people are too. Sometimes, if you are a rebel, you realize that the stupidest thing you could possibly do would be to put up a flag and say, "Ha ha ha! I'm a rebel. We're autonomous now." Then they kind of got a crack. No, government. I'm sure there's lots of places like that in the world. Anyway, so it makes you think, like, okay, well, if that's not true. There are cases like Somalia, but come on, Somalia is a case where the government broke down while people were already in a civil war.
In the Depression, there was a systematic policy of disrupting sales when they'd foreclose on farms. All the farmers in the neighborhood would show up at the auction with guns, and somebody would bid $1. No one dared to say anything else, and they'd give it back to the farmer again. Anyway, I thought technology was supposed to increase our social possibilities. And not only that, people seem to think that's true of all future technologies as well. We'll never be able to invent anything which would allow a different type of economic system. I'm sure there's a million different ways. We're just not putting our minds to it because the people who, are best able to do such things are, mostly bought, either have no resources to work with, or they're bought out by people who want to reproduce the same system. I occasionally get messages. I got one the other day from these physicists in Germany. Have you ever heard of these guys? They said, well, we're a bunch of physicists, and we feel that a lot of the problems the world has today is that we're still using a Newtonian notion of money, and we want to have a quantum theory of money. We're working, and they sent me this paper, like, completely full of equations in which I did not understand a single thing. Okay, maybe that'll work, But there's lots of people like that. Who knows what they'll come up with if they try to put their minds to it.
I'm actually now working on a 20 or 30,000 year scale for my next one. I'm working with an archaeologist friend.
That's more like it.
Yeah. I'm working with an archaeologist friend on this, named David Wencrow. I think is in the audience. Hey, David. So they really pushed this originally Puritan idea that work is just valuable in itself. It doesn't have to produce anything. So in a perverse way, the uselessness of the work actually became a virtue because anything that made the work fulfilling sort of undercut that disciplinary role of work. So, and this is the way people think nowadays. If there's any way somebody would get any pleasure or fulfillment out of a job, they think they don't have to pay them. or there should be some way that they can get them to do it for free, right? Real work is work that's meaningless. That's how you have these corporations that don't feel they have to pay people to do art or translation or anything that you might do because you actually have some interest in the subject, but are willing to shell out all this money on corporate lawyers and strategic vision coordinators.
One of the fascinating things, I have this conversation all the time, being both an anarchist and an anthropologist, with people who are skeptical about the idea of radically transforming modern society, and they always justify it technologically, actually. Everybody turns into a technological determinist when you throw radical ideas at them. And so, as an anthropologist, I know perfectly well that, there's an endless variety of economic and political forms that have existed over human history, of very radically different ones. And when you start pointing that out to people, people say, oh yeah, but I'm talking about something that actually worked. And so, well, there's this that worked, there's that worked. I said, yeah, but those guys were primitives, we're talking about modern technological society. It's never gonna work there. To which, of course, the reply is that, wait a minute, I thought that technology was supposed to increase our possibilities. You're saying that, primitive people have lots of social and economic possibilities, and now that we have, machines, we don't anymore? Which is hard enough as an argument, but in order to really maintain that argument that, nothing else is possible, you have to argue not only that the particular current technology that we have now could never allow for anything but one social system that would actually work, but any possible future technology. Now think about that. What's the chance of that? That's completely absurd.
And I was assuming that when they started looking into this, that you'd have to tease out hints because they wouldn't admit that this is where they were getting it from. They would pretend they were getting it from classical sources. But I was amazed to discover, no, they were just totally explicit. That we got this from Native Americans, and then just nobody believes them.
Right. That's roughly it.
I guess. But
there's also modular, sort of extendable versions of personalized relations you can establish. So the famous Middle Eastern tradition, when you buy something, first you have to have tea, and then you can argue with each other.
Yes.
So there's micro versions you can do.
Yes. So I guess what you're doing when you have tea is you're trying to establish a relationship where honor and shame can operate.
Are relevant, right?
Yes, because honor and shame clearly don't operate if you're never going to see the person again.
I wrote a book on value theory, and one of the things that really realized is what value is all about is about an audience. You need to realize forms of value, but it's irrelevant to realize them in the eyes of someone else. And in fact, for any person, society are those people who care that you got whatever it is you're trying to get. We could do a whole social science based on that, because everybody in this room has a different.
I didn't get that sentence. Sorry.
You could probably create a whole social science starting from that inside. What are the things that you think are important to achieve in your life, and who do you care knows whether you did it or not?
Yes. Okay.
So everybody in this room has a different sort of virtual body of people who they want to know that they got something or didn't get something, or they care what they think. And another body of people who it never really occurs to them to even wonder what they think of them.
Yeah, so I think Dunbar's thing was in trying to understand what that body consisted of in terms of numbers. There's a very beautiful story in that Garrett Hardin book called Managing the Commons about a religious group called the Hutterites.
Oh yeah.
The Hutterites were
So, for every case like Somalia, which you hear about because there's violence, there's probably a dozen like Madagascar where nobody even knows. All right, so you have this happen. Well, it makes you think, well, wait a minute. What is it about living under a state, under someone else's authority, under the constant threat of violence if you break the rules, that actually causes behavior that makes it seem self-evident that people would behave violently if there wasn't such structures? Because in fact, if there aren't such structures, that's not how they are. Anyway, okay, so there I was in Madagascar. I come back, I get a job, I'm teaching at Yale. One day I walk out of class, and there's a newspaper box that says, excuse me, says martial law declared in Seattle. I like that, which is what most people in America say at that time. And you know, soon enough I discovered that the social movement that I'd always kind of wished would exist but didn't actually had formed during the time that I wasn't paying attention. I immediately, thank you. That was very good. This is my fourth of it today.
Well, nobody knew. I mean, and one can't predict. I mean, obviously, I can't come up with a grandiose scenario of exactly what would have happened because we don't know which of those technologies would have happened. What we do know is that you can demonstrate exactly the point at which people started freaking out at the possibility. This is why I talked about Alvin Toffler. Did you hear about that? Actually, yeah, I can't repeat the whole. I can't repeat the whole paper.
Rather than in most anarchist groups operate by a consensus principle, and people assume this will never work. You know, because anybody can veto a proposal. It has to be based on some moral principle. It can't just be, I don't like it. But if you feel there's something terribly wrong, it's like everybody's the Supreme Court or has the right to and everybody says, well, that'll never work because everybody will block all the time. And in fact, what we usually get in these groups, again, there's a problem of scale here, but is that nobody ever does it. And we have a problem that people don't block enough because it's like you're giving everybody a little bomb and saying you can blow up the thing at any time. And everybody suddenly feels, well, I feel so good about myself, joining with the popular will, even though I don't think this is a very good idea. I could stop this at any time, and then they don't do it. Yeah. They become super responsible.
But so they make the same arguments about division of labor you get in these early political economists, but the one difference is they assume that ultimately markets are an expression of mutual aid. Because like when you know each other, you can make things for each other and help each other, but people you don't know, you have to have some method, so you create this sort of fair market price kind of thing going on with each other. So the one thing they don't assume is that it's all based on selfish competition. I mean, selfish competition has its role, they say, but it's ultimately, if you think about it, like from each according to their abilities, supply and demand, they're not completely separate concepts. You can see how somebody could go there. But the way I put it is, well, it makes sense. Once you're operating outside state enforcement, well, you can't have cutthroat competition when there's nobody stopping you from actually cutting each other's throats. So you have to have a certain level of trust to be able to operate at all. So that changes the whole nature of the transactions.
But the interesting thing, so he knew that this could work. And I always say that most people don't think anarchism is a bad idea. They think it's insane, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, that would never happen. But, I didn't grow up in a family where people thought it was insane because they'd seen it work,
Yeah.
So if it's not crazy, why not be one?
Well, and the funny thing is, everybody has experience of it working at small scale.
And that's what I mean by the everyday communism.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we all do communism all the time. If it's all just means from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. Actually, what I discovered, with the Occupy movement is that Americans, for example, are much better at communism than they are at democracy. Because everybody has, experience participating in a communal project where things are allocated from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs.
Yes.
And that's what you do if you're trying to fix something, if you're trying to get a task done together. But, when it comes to getting together in large groups and making a collective decision, no one had ever done that.
You have people like Kropotkin who represent sort of actually very pro-technology side. Who had as a direct answer to the robot laundromat problem, when people say, why are there dirty jobs? Or who would do the dirty jobs? In an egalitarian society, you're saying everybody has to be a coal miner, was Kropotkin's answer is like, well, if everybody had to do it, coal mining robots would be invented immediately. The only reason we don't have these technologies is because rich people don't really need them.
I would actually go back to the First Amendment and actually make it law. It says in the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, or of the press. And in fact, there's nothing but laws abridging freedom. They say, well, of course you can have freedom of assembly, you just need to get the cop's permission first, And it's like, you just try to talk to American journalists and point this out. Like, well, if you have to ask the cops permission to say something, that's called not having freedom of speech, right? You know, to print something. So why is it different with assembly? So, well, there's traffic problems, you know. There's nothing about right to traffic flow in the Constitution. There is something about right to freedom of assembly. So I just say enforce that law, and I think the rest we can take care of ourselves. We act as if ideas are scarce on this. This is not a natural way to think. This is a result of a 30-year campaign against the imagination to convince us that people are not basically imaginative or ideas are not out there. I would say there's nobody on earth right now who could not think of at least one idea of how to solve a common problem that plagues us that none of us could have thought of, right? Now, why is it we're not hearing those things from them? Well, because 99.9% of them spend most of their lives being told to shut up all the time. And we need to figure out how to create mechanisms to stop doing that. And once we do, I think the rest will take care of itself.